The airport was busy, passengers moving in every direction, but all eyes turned when it happened. A sharp slap echoed through the boarding gate. An elderly woman's cane hit the floor as she steadied herself, lifting her gaze to the flight attendant who had just struck her. The entire terminal fell silent. Ms. Pratt, the flight attendant, stood stiffly, her face tight with frustration. "I told you to step aside," she snapped. But the elderly woman didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she bent down, picked up her cane, and looked Ms. Pratt directly in the eyes. And with a quiet, steady voice, she said something that sent a chill through the air. "You just made the worst mistake of your life." Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. The airport lounge had a quiet hum, filled with the soft clinking of coffee cups and the occasional murmur of conversations. In a corner near the window, Eloise Lancaster sat with her hands gently folded over the handle of her cane. She was dressed in a simple navy blue dress, her silver hair neatly pinned back. Her presence was unassuming, blending in with the rest of the travelers waiting for their flights. She watched the planes take off in the distance, her expression calm, as if she had done this countless times before. A young businessman, Dorian Vance, sitting nearby, noticed her and with a polite nod stood up to offer his seat. She gave him a small smile and thanked him, but she remained seated, perfectly comfortable where she was. Most people didn't give her a second glance. Just another elderly woman traveling alone. But the ones who did notice had no idea who she really was. At the check-in counter, the flight attendants were busy organizing the boarding process, their voices crisp as they directed passengers. Among them, a tall woman with sharp features and a name tag that read, "Ms. Pratt," moved with an air of authority. She had been working in first class for years and carried herself like she owned the section. She scanned the passengers in the lounge with a quick, practiced eye, noting who looked like they belonged in first class and who didn't. Her gaze briefly passed over Eloise before moving on, barely registering her presence. She was more focused on the well-dressed business executives and high-profile travelers who would be expecting top-tier service. When the first-class boarding announcement was made, Eloise slowly rose to her feet, adjusting her grip on her cane before making her way toward the gate. She walked with steady steps, unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world. Passengers around her weaved through the line, eager to get to their seats. As she reached the entrance, she handed her ticket to Ms. Pratt, who barely glanced at it before stopping her with a firm hand. "Ma'am, this is the first-class line," Ms. Pratt said, her tone polite but clipped. Eloise looked up at her, her expression unreadable. "Yes, I know," she replied, her voice gentle. Ms. Pratt sighed, looking down at the boarding pass in her hand. She frowned slightly, her eyebrows knitting together. The seat number was in first class, but that didn't make sense to her. "Are you sure this is your ticket?" Ms. Pratt asked, tilting her head slightly as if expecting an easy explanation. Eloise didn't seem offended. "I'm quite sure," she answered simply. Ms. Pratt pressed her lips together, glancing behind Eloise to see if a caretaker or family member would step forward to clarify the mistake. But no one did. Eloise was traveling alone. Ms. Pratt exhaled, shaking her head. "There might have been an error. First class is reserved for certain passengers," she said carefully, as if explaining to a child. "Economy boarding is over there." She pointed toward the other gate, her patience already thinning. Eloise didn't move. She looked at Ms. Pratt with the same calm expression, not arguing, not raising her voice. "There is no mistake," she said after a moment. "This is my seat." Ms. Pratt's jaw tightened. She had seen this before. Passengers trying to sneak into first class with fake tickets, travelers getting upgrades they didn't pay for. She had no patience for it. With a sharp sigh, she held the ticket up toward the overhead lights, checking for any signs that it wasn't real. "I don't know how you got this," she muttered under her breath, shaking her head. "But you can't sit here." The line behind them was growing. A few passengers watched the exchange, some with curiosity, others pretending not to notice. One or two exchanged glances, shifting uncomfortably. Dorian, the young businessman who had offered Eloise a seat earlier, hesitated, looking like he wanted to say something, but he stayed silent. Ms. Pratt's voice grew firmer. "I don't have time for this," she snapped. "Step aside." When Eloise still didn't move, Ms. Pratt's patience snapped. With a sudden, sharp motion, she slapped Eloise's hand away from the counter. The impact wasn't hard, but the sound rang through the quiet gate like a crack of lightning. Eloise's cane slipped from her grasp, clattering onto the polished floor. A hush fell over the passengers. A few gasped. One woman, Teresa Langley, covered her mouth in shock. Dorian stiffened, his eyes widening, but Ms. Pratt didn't seem to care. "I told you to move," she said coldly. Eloise bent down slowly, her hands steady as she reached for her cane. There was no anger in her face, no sign of distress. She straightened up with careful grace, her gaze settling on Ms. Pratt with an intensity that made the flight attendant take a half step back. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Then in a voice so calm it sent a chill through the air, Eloise spoke. "You just made the worst mistake of your life," Ms. Pratt scoffed, shifting uncomfortably under Eloise's steady gaze. "Ma'am, I don't have time for games," she said, her voice laced with impatience. "If you don't move, I'll have security escort you out." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Dorian clenched his jaw, debating whether to step in. Teresa, the woman who had gasped earlier, looked around at the other passengers, as if hoping someone would speak up, but no one did. They simply watched, waiting to see how it would unfold. Eloise remained where she was, unshaken. She slowly lifted her cane, gripping the handle with a quiet confidence that made Ms. Pratt's irritation deepen. "I am sitting in first class," Eloise said, her voice still composed, "and I am boarding this flight." Ms. Pratt let out a sharp breath, her patience running thin. "Unbelievable," she muttered under her breath. Without another word, she turned to a younger flight attendant standing nearby. "Leah, call security," she ordered. Leah hesitated, her eyes darting between Ms. Pratt and Eloise. Something about this didn't feel right. The older woman wasn't acting like someone who had made a mistake. She wasn't panicked or scrambling for excuses. She was calm, too calm, but Ms. Pratt's glare was hard to ignore. Before Leah could reach for the intercom, a deep, commanding voice interrupted. "That won't be necessary." Everyone turned. A senior airline official, Gerald Whitaker, strode toward them, his suit neatly pressed, a badge clipped to his chest. His face was unreadable, but there was an undeniable weight to his presence. He didn't even glance at Miss Pratt before addressing Eloise directly. "Mrs. Lancaster," he said with quiet respect, "apologies for the delay. Your seat is waiting for you." Miss Pratt blinked, her mouth opening slightly before closing again. "Wait, what?" Gerald finally turned to face her, his expression cool. "Step aside, Miss Pratt." The silence that followed was deafening. Miss Pratt swallowed hard, her throat dry. Something was very, very wrong. Miss Pratt stiffened, her fingers tightening around the boarding pass still clutched in her hand. "There has to be some kind of mistake," she said, forcing a strained chuckle. "I mean, Gerald cut her off with a sharp look. "There is no mistake." His voice was even, but the authority in his tone sent a chill through Miss Pratt. "Step aside." Leah, still frozen in place, felt a sinking weight in her stomach. She wasn't sure what was happening, but she knew this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. Teresa Langley, still standing near the boarding line, exchanged wide-eyed glances with Dorian. The crowd was no longer just murmuring. They were outright whispering now, passengers leaning toward each other in quiet speculation. Ms. Pratt's face burned as she looked between Gerald and Eloise. The elderly woman was completely composed, watching the scene unfold with an unreadable expression. Something about her calmness made Ms. Pratt's nerves fray even more. Trying to regain control, she squared her shoulders. "I was just following protocol," she insisted. "There was an issue with the ticket." Gerald's eyes narrowed. "Did you check the system before removing her from the boarding line?" Ms. Pratt hesitated. She had scanned the ticket, yes, but she hadn't actually checked the system. She had just assumed. The realization made her stomach twist. Gerald didn't wait for an answer. "Escort Mrs. Lancaster to her seat," he instructed Leah. His tone left no room for argument. Leah nodded quickly, stepping forward. "Right this way, ma'am," she said softly. Eloise gave Miss Pratt one last look before following Leah through the gate. Her steps were slow but deliberate, her cane tapping lightly against the floor. As she passed the crowd of passengers, they parted for her like water around a stone. Miss Pratt felt her pulse hammering in her ears. Then Gerald took a step closer to her, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "When this flight takes off, I suggest you prepare for a very serious conversation." Ms. Pratt swallowed hard. She could feel the weight of every set of eyes on her, burning into her like a spotlight. The ground beneath her suddenly felt very, very unsteady. Ms. Pratt stood frozen as Gerald walked away, his words lingering in the air like an invisible noose tightening around her. Her pulse pounded in her ears, her confidence now shaken. The other passengers slowly turned back to their own matters, but a few still threw curious glances her way. She knew what they were thinking. What had she done? Leah guided Eloise through the jet bridge, her movements careful and respectful. Unlike Miss Pratt, she hadn't dismissed the elderly woman. Something about Eloise's presence felt different, and now with the way Gerald had spoken to her, Leah was certain of it. "I apologize for that, ma'am," Leah said as they reached the first-class cabin. "I should have stepped in sooner." Eloise gave a small smile, settling into her seat with practiced ease. "It's quite all right, dear," she said, adjusting her cane beside her. "I've dealt with people like her before." Leah hesitated, lowering her voice. "Who exactly are you?" Eloise's eyes twinkled with something unreadable, but she didn't answer. Instead, she simply leaned back, comfortable, as if she belonged there more than anyone else. Leah didn't press further. She simply nodded and stepped away, though curiosity buzzed in her mind. Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, Ms. Pratt forced herself to move, heading toward the galley with stiff, robotic steps. She needed a moment to breathe, to think. What had just happened? Why had Gerald reacted like that? And why had that old woman walked away as if she had won something? She reached for a cup of water with shaking hands, her mind racing. Then, before she could take a sip, the intercom crackled to life. "Ms. Pratt, please report to the cockpit immediately." The paper cup crumpled slightly in her grip. Her throat went dry. She had never been called to the cockpit before a flight. Whatever was happening, it wasn't good. Ms. Pratt's legs felt heavy as she made her way to the cockpit, her mind running through every possible reason she could be summoned. Maybe it was just a procedural issue. Maybe Gerald wanted a private word before the flight took off. But deep down, she knew better. She stepped inside and the tension hit her instantly. The captain, Nigel Dawson, sat in his seat, his hands resting calmly on the controls, but his eyes were sharp. Next to him, on the in-flight operations screen, was Robert Ellington, one of the highest-ranking executives in the airline's corporate office. His expression was unreadable, but his presence alone sent a wave of panic through Ms. Pratt. Gerald stood to the side, his arms crossed. The moment she entered, the silence in the cockpit felt suffocating. "Ms. Pratt," Robert's voice came through the speakers, steady but firm. "I need you to explain why you refused a first-class passenger her seat." Ms. Pratt's mouth went dry. I didn't refuse," she stammered. "I thought there was a mistake with her ticket." Robert's head tilted slightly. "Did you verify that mistake before asking her to step aside?" Ms. Pratt hesitated. Captain Dawson sighed, rubbing his temple. Gerald, however, was less patient. "Answer the question," he demanded. Ms. Pratt swallowed hard. I assumed there was an issue." Robert exhaled through his nose. "Ms. Pratt, do you know who that woman is?" Ms. Pratt's fingers twitched against her uniform. Her mind scrambled, trying to piece together what she had missed. She was just some old woman, just another passenger. Right? Seeing her hesitation, Robert's voice dropped lower, colder. "Her name is Eloise Lancaster. She is the chairwoman of this airline." The words hit like a slap. Miss Pratt felt the air in her lungs vanish. Captain Dawson glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Gerald, on the other hand, didn't bother hiding his disapproval. Robert's voice came again, slow and deliberate. "The founder of this company, the woman who built this airline from the ground up, and you humiliated her in front of an entire boarding gate." Ms. Pratt's knees nearly buckled. She had slapped the hand of the most powerful woman in the airline industry, in front of passengers, in front of employees, in front of people who would never forget it. Robert let the silence stretch before delivering the final blow. "You will fix this immediately, or you will not be working here when this plane lands." Ms. Pratt's throat tightened, her pulse hammering in her ears. She struggled to process Robert's words, but they echoed in her mind like a relentless drumbeat. Eloise Lancaster, chairwoman, founder, the most powerful woman in the airline. How had she missed this? How had she been so blind? She forced herself to speak, though her voice felt foreign in her own mouth. I didn't know, she said weakly. She didn't. What, Miss Pratt? Gerald's voice cut through the cockpit, sharp as a blade. His patience had run dry. Didn't look like she belonged? Didn't meet your personal standard for first class? Ms. Pratt flinched at the accusation. That's not, Robert interrupted, his voice cold. Miss Pratt, do you think that if you had recognized her name, you would have treated her the same way? Ms. Pratt opened her mouth, but no words came, because they all knew the answer. If she had known who Eloise was, she would have greeted her with respect, escorted her personally, and ensured she had the finest service. She wouldn't have dared to question her ticket. She wouldn't have slapped her hand. Her silence only confirmed what they already knew. The weight of the room pressed down on her. Captain Dawson exhaled heavily, shifting in his seat. Gerald shook his head, his jaw set in disappointment. Robert, still watching from the screen, gave a slow nod, as if he had expected this outcome all along. You will return to Mrs. Lancaster, Robert said, his voice final. You will offer her a full, public apology in front of the passengers you humiliated her in front of, and then you will personally escort her to her seat and ensure she is treated with the highest level of respect. Ms. Pratt's stomach twisted. Sir, This is not a request, Robert said sharply. This is the only thing standing between you and immediate termination. If you refuse, you will not finish this flight in uniform. Ms. Pratt knew she had no choice. Shame burned through her as she nodded stiffly. Understood, she whispered. Gerald didn't move. Captain Dawson didn't speak. No one offered her a shred of sympathy. Her body felt heavy as she turned on her heel and made her way out of the cockpit. The moment she stepped back into the first-class cabin, she felt the shift. Passengers were settled now, but their eyes flickered toward her. They knew. Maybe not everything, but they knew something had happened. The murmurs from the gate had followed her here, and now every step she took toward Eloise Lancaster felt like a walk of shame. Eloise sat comfortably in her seat, her posture relaxed, her cane resting beside her. Leah stood nearby, watching cautiously, uncertain what was about to unfold. Miss Pratt stopped beside Eloise, her hands trembling slightly as she forced herself to speak the words she never thought she'd have to say. Mrs. Lancaster. Her voice cracked, but she swallowed the lump in her throat and tried again. I need to apologize for how I treated you earlier. Eloise slowly turned her head toward her. The elderly woman's face remained calm, but there was something in her eyes, something unreadable, something sharp. The moment stretched between them. Passengers nearby shifted, their curiosity heightening. Even Leah held her breath, waiting. Ms. Pratt's shame deepened. She had humiliated this woman. She had treated her like an inconvenience, like she didn't belong, and now she was the one feeling small. She inhaled shakily and continued. I misjudged you. I was wrong, and I sincerely apologize. Eloise studied her, then tilted her head slightly. Apologize for what exactly? The question made Ms. Pratt's stomach churn. She wanted to shrink away, to end this as quickly as possible, but she knew she couldn't. Not without making this right. So, she forced herself to say the truth. I assumed you didn't belong in first class. I treated you unfairly, and I disrespected you in front of everyone. Eloise didn't respond right away. She let the words settle in the air, making sure Ms. Pratt felt the weight of them. Then finally she nodded once. Thank you for your apology, she said simply. Ms. Pratt exhaled, thinking that was the end of it. But then Eloise picked up her glass of water, took a small sip, and said something that made Ms. Pratt's stomach drop. Now tell them. The air shifted. Ms. Pratt blinked. Tell who? Eloise gestured toward the passengers, the ones who had witnessed the incident, the ones who had heard her snap at an elderly woman, the ones who had watched her slap the hand of the chairwoman of the airline. I accepted your apology, Eloise said, setting her glass down. But they need to hear it too. Ms. Pratt felt the blood drain from her face. A cold wave of dread washed over Ms. Pratt as Eloise's words settled into the air. The passengers who had been stealing glances at the scene now stared openly, waiting to see what would happen next. The soft hum of the aircraft's engines filled the silence, but inside the cabin, the tension was suffocating. Ms. Pratt felt her entire body tighten. Apologizing to Eloise had been humiliating enough, but now she was being asked to admit her mistake in front of everyone? She could already feel the judgmental stares, the whispering, the silent condemnations from people who had done nothing when it had mattered. Why should she be the only one held accountable? But she didn't have a choice. Robert Ellington had been clear. If she didn't make this right, her career was over before the plane even left the ground. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to turn toward the cabin. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides before she slowly unclenched them, forcing her arms to rest stiffly at her front. Her throat felt painfully dry. She started, but the words barely came out. The moment felt too big, too overwhelming. Her gaze flickered toward Gerald, who now stood at the front of the cabin, watching her with arms crossed. His eyes held no sympathy, only expectation. She had dug this hole. Now she had to climb out of it. Ms. Pratt inhaled deeply, then spoke louder, forcing her voice to carry. "I need to apologize to all of you." A murmur rippled through the cabin. A few passengers sat up straighter. Dorian, the businessman from earlier, lifted an eyebrow, his fingers still idly tapping against the armrest of his seat. Teresa Langley, the woman who had gasped when Eloise had been slapped, watched with quiet satisfaction. Ms. Pratt forced herself to continue. "Earlier, before we boarded, I made an assumption about a passenger, an assumption that was wrong. I treated Mrs. Lancaster unfairly. I questioned her place in first class when I had no right to." She paused, inhaling sharply, her pride clawing at her like an open wound. "And I—" Her jaw tightened, the words feeling like thorns on her tongue. "I put my hands on her in a way that was completely inappropriate." Now the murmur in the cabin grew louder. Some exchanged surprised glances, while others nodded knowingly. They had seen the slap. They had heard Miss Pratt's condescending tone, but hearing her admit it, hearing her say it out loud, made the moment hit differently. Miss Pratt's pulse pounded in her ears. She forced herself to lift her chin slightly, to own what she had done, even though it made her feel exposed. "What I did was unprofessional, uncalled for, and completely unacceptable," she said, her voice quieter now. "And for that, I sincerely apologize." A heavy silence followed. Miss Pratt didn't know what she had expected. Maybe some kind of acknowledgement, maybe for someone to dismiss the whole thing and move on. But the worst part was the way everyone simply stared. There was no applause, no verbal forgiveness. Just a long, excruciating moment where she could feel the weight of her mistake pressing down on her like a boulder. Then finally Eloise spoke. "Thank you for your apology," she said, her voice as composed as ever. "But I do hope you understand something, Miss Pratt." Miss Pratt turned back to face her, dreading what was coming next. Eloise leaned forward slightly, her sharp eyes locking onto Miss Pratt's. "If I were just another elderly woman, if I were just another passenger, do you think you would be standing here right now?" The question hit like a punch to the gut. Miss Pratt's breath hitched. She knew the answer. They all did. If Eloise had been anyone else, if she hadn't been the chairwoman of the airline, there would have been no intervention, no apology, no consequences. Ms. Pratt would have continued her day as if nothing had happened. The passengers around them shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away. Others held their gazes firm, waiting to see if she would dare to deny it. Ms. Pratt's hands clenched at her sides again, but this time there was no frustration, only shame. She swallowed, struggling to find her voice. When she finally spoke, it was quiet. "No," she admitted. "I wouldn't." Eloise didn't react right away. She just studied her, as if searching for something deeper. Then with a small, knowing nod, she finally leaned back in her seat. Miss Pratt's stomach twisted as she turned, eager to escape the attention now burning against her skin. But before she could walk away, Gerald's voice stopped her cold. "Miss Pratt," he said, his tone neutral but heavy with meaning, "escort Mrs. Lancaster for the remainder of this flight. Personally, Ms. Pratt went still, her head snapped up, eyes widening slightly. That wasn't just a punishment. That was a public display of power. Eloise's presence alone would be a constant reminder of her mistake. And now, instead of escaping to the galley and hiding from the rest of the flight, she would have to serve the very woman she had disrespected. Eloise, meanwhile, simply picked up her book and turned the page. The message was clear. This wasn't over yet. Miss Pratt felt her entire body tense at Gerald's words. Escort Mrs. Lancaster for the remainder of this flight. Personally, it wasn't a request. It was a demand, one she had no choice but to obey. A part of her wanted to argue, to insist that another flight attendant could handle it, but she had already pushed her luck too far. The humiliation of apologizing in front of everyone had left her pride in pieces. But this was worse. The murmurs in the cabin had quieted, but the air still felt thick with tension. The passengers weren't just watching anymore. They were waiting to see how Miss Pratt would handle her new reality. Leah hesitated beside her, clearly uncertain whether she should step in. But Gerald's sharp gaze left no room for negotiation. Miss Pratt inhaled sharply, forcing herself to move. She turned stiffly back toward Eloise, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "If there's anything you need, Mrs. Lancaster," she said, voice strained, "please don't hesitate to ask." Eloise didn't look up from her book right away. She took her time, finishing a line before slowly turning her gaze toward Miss Pratt. There was no smugness in her expression, no satisfaction, just the same calm authority she had carried from the start. "I'll keep that in mind," Eloise said simply, before returning to her reading. The dismissal was clear. Miss Pratt felt her face burn as she turned, forcing herself to stand near the front of the cabin, where she would be visible to everyone. No escape, no hiding. Gerald, satisfied, gave her a final glance before stepping toward the cockpit. Leah lingered for a moment, giving Miss Pratt a look that was hard to read. Pity, maybe? Or something else? "I can help if you need me to," Leah offered quietly. Miss Pratt clenched her jaw. She didn't need Leah's sympathy. "I have it handled," she muttered. Leah nodded, but didn't look convinced. With one last glance toward Eloise, she walked away, leaving Miss Pratt standing awkwardly by herself. She could feel the eyes on her, passengers sneaking glances, pretending to be occupied with their in-flight magazines or screens, but still very much aware of what had just unfolded. Dorian Vance, the businessman from earlier, didn't even bother pretending. He studied her openly, tapping a slow rhythm against his armrest. His expression wasn't mocking, but it wasn't entirely sympathetic either. It was like he was watching a lesson unfold, one that he wasn't sure Ms. Pratt had fully learned yet. Ms. Pratt forced herself to stand tall, though her insides felt twisted into knots. She had never felt so small. As the flight continued, Ms. Pratt did her best to ignore the weight of the humiliation pressing down on her. She kept moving, kept working, forcing herself to go through the motions as if nothing had happened. But she couldn't ignore Eloise. Every time she walked past her seat, the presence of the elderly woman felt larger than life. Not because she was doing anything. She was simply existing, sitting there reading, sipping her water, occasionally glancing out the window. But every now and then, her eyes would flicker toward Miss Pratt. Just for a second, not in malice, not in anger, just watching. And somehow, that was worse. At one point, Miss Pratt brought a fresh tray of drinks through the first-class cabin, carefully setting them down in front of passengers. As she reached Eloise's seat, she hesitated, debating whether she should say something or simply place the drink down and leave. Eloise glanced up at her, her face unreadable. I brought you some fresh water," Miss Pratt finally said, her voice quieter than usual. Eloise nodded, setting her book down. "Thank you." Miss Pratt reached forward to place the glass on the table, but her hands weren't as steady as they should have been. The glass wobbled slightly before landing with a soft clink. She never fumbled, not with service, not with simple tasks. But now her hands trembled ever so slightly, and Eloise noticed. Miss Pratt pulled her hands back quickly, straightening her posture. But before she could walk away, Eloise spoke again. "You've been with this airline for a long time, haven't you?" Miss Pratt stiffened. "Yes," she said cautiously. Eloise studied her for a moment, then nodded. And in all that time, has anyone ever questioned whether you belonged here? Ms. Pratt's stomach twisted. She knew what Eloise was really asking. Had anyone ever assumed she wasn't fit for her job? Had anyone ever dismissed her before she even had the chance to prove herself? Number. Of course not. She had always walked through the cabin with confidence. She had never been looked down on, never been told she didn't belong, but that was exactly what she had done to Eloise. Ms. Pratt's mouth felt dry. She didn't know what to say. She wanted to defend herself, to say that it wasn't about that she had just been doing her job, that she had just been trying to maintain order. But that would be a lie. So, for the first time in a long time, Ms. Pratt said nothing. Eloise didn't press further. She simply picked up her water, took a slow sip, and returned to her book. Ms. Pratt turned away, but the weight of the conversation clung to her like a shadow. For the first time, she wasn't just humiliated. She was ashamed. Ms. Pratt moved through the first-class cabin like a ghost, her mind buzzing with thoughts she couldn't escape. Every step felt heavier. Every glance from the passengers felt like another reminder of the moment she had lost control. She had spent years commanding respect on flights, making sure everything ran efficiently, ensuring passengers followed the rules. But now she was the one who had been put in her place. She tried to focus on her work, pouring drinks, straightening trays, offering forced smiles to passengers who still looked at her with lingering curiosity. But no matter what she did, her mind kept circling back to Eloise's words. And in all that time, has anyone ever questioned whether you belonged here? Ms. Pratt knew the answer, and she hated that she knew. At the front of the plane, Gerald stood near the galley, arms crossed as he watched her move stiffly through the aisles. She could feel his eyes on her, tracking every mistake, every hesitation. "You're struggling," he finally said when she reached the galley. Ms. Pratt bristled at the comment. "I'm fine," she muttered, reaching for a tray of refreshments. Gerald let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "Number, you're not." Ms. Pratt's jaw clenched, but she didn't respond. Gerald leaned slightly against the counter, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You've been doing this job for a long time, Pratt. Long enough to know better than what you pulled back there." Ms. Pratt stiffened. "You assumed something about her," Gerald continued. "And that assumption? It wasn't about her ticket. It wasn't about rules. It was about what you thought a first-class passenger should look like." Ms. Pratt's fingers dug into the edge of the counter. "I didn't mean—" "Doesn't matter what you meant," Gerald interrupted, his voice firm. "It matters what you did." Ms. Pratt felt the sting of those words, but she refused to let it show. She squared her shoulders, keeping her face neutral. "I already apologized," she said, her voice flat. Gerald studied her for a long moment, then gave a slow, knowing nod. "Yeah," he murmured, "but do you even understand why you're apologizing?" Ms. Pratt's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to snap back, to tell him of course she understood. She had made a mistake. She had disrespected a passenger. She had misjudged the situation. But deep down, she knew that wasn't what he was asking. He wasn't asking if she understood what she had done. He was asking if she understood why she had done it. Ms. Pratt turned away, busying herself with a napkin that didn't need adjusting. "I need to get back to work," she muttered. Gerald didn't push further. He just exhaled and stepped back. "Then get back to work," he said simply. But as she left the galley, his words lingered. The flight continued without further incident. Passengers settled into their seats, meals were served, drinks were poured. But Ms. Pratt could feel the energy in the air had changed. She wasn't in charge anymore. She wasn't the respected, confident flight attendant commanding the cabin. She was the lesson, and everyone on that plane had learned something from watching her fall. Dorian Vance, the businessman from earlier, caught her eye as she moved past his seat. "Quite the day, huh?" he mused, sipping his drink. Miss Pratt forced a thin smile. "Just another flight," she said, trying to sound casual. Dorian smirked. "Sure," he said, unconvinced. He glanced toward Eloise, who remained perfectly calm in her seat, flipping the page of her book. Then he looked back at Ms. Pratt. "You know, I travel first class all the time," he said, voice low. "And I've seen flight attendants like you before. Strict, efficient, no patience for nonsense. Usually I respect that." Ms. Pratt's eyebrow twitched slightly. "Usually?" Dorian shrugged, swirling the liquid in his glass. Usually, he repeated. But today I saw someone who thought she could decide who belonged and who didn't. And that? He took a slow sip, letting the words hang between them. That's not respect. That's bias. Ms. Pratt felt the hit of his words like a slap. She wanted to walk away, wanted to dismiss him, just like she had dismissed Eloise. But she couldn't, because deep down she knew he was right. Dorian didn't say anything else. He just turned back to his drink, the conversation over. Ms. Pratt walked away, but the weight in her chest only grew heavier. She had spent years thinking she was good at her job because she followed the rules. But today she realized she had been following her own rules, ones that had nothing to do with the airline's policies and everything to do with her own assumptions. And now she was paying for it. Ms. Pratt moved through the cabin with a stiffness she couldn't shake, her mind tangled in thoughts she didn't want to confront. She had spent years believing she was the kind of flight attendant who upheld standards, who maintained order, who kept things running smoothly. But today she had been forced to see something else, that she had used those standards as an excuse for her own biases. She hated how easily Dorian's words had cut through her. That's not respect, that's bias. He had said it so plainly, so matter of fact, as if it were obvious. And maybe it had been, to everyone except her. She reached the galley, pressing her hands against the counter to steady herself. The hum of the aircraft filled the silence, but in her head she could still hear Gerald's voice, Dorian's voice, Eloise's voice, all echoing the same truth she didn't want to face. She had been wrong, not just about Eloise, but about how she saw people. She had looked at Eloise and made an assumption before the older woman had even opened her mouth. She had decided without thinking that Eloise wasn't supposed to be in first class. And if Gerald hadn't stepped in, if Eloise hadn't been Eloise Lancaster, nothing would have happened. The realization hit like a gut punch. Her fingers curled against the cool metal of the counter. What did that say about her? The intercom crackled to life, snapping her from her thoughts. The captain's voice came through, calm and steady. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for landing. Ms. Pratt straightened, brushing off her uniform as if she could shake off the discomfort pressing down on her. She turned on autopilot, moving through the motions as she had done thousands of times before, checking seatbelts, securing tray tables, making sure everything was in place. But she wasn't really present. Her mind was still back at the gate, back in that moment when she had made the wrong call and never once second-guessed herself. She reached Eloise's seat last. The older woman was already buckled in, hands resting gently over her lap, looking out the window at the city growing closer beneath them. For a moment, Miss Pratt just stood there, unsure if she should say something, if she even could say something. Then before she could decide, Eloise spoke without turning her head. "You're thinking about it now, aren't you?" Ms. Pratt tensed slightly. "Thinking about what?" she asked, though she knew exactly what Eloise meant. Eloise finally turned to face her, her expression unreadable. "About why you did it." Ms. Pratt opened her mouth, but the words didn't come. Because Eloise was right. She had been thinking about it. Ever since she had stepped out of that cockpit, ever since she had been forced to stand in front of the entire cabin and own up to her actions. And now, standing here in front of Eloise, she didn't have an excuse left to give. The plane jolted slightly as the landing gear lowered, the familiar pressure shift signaling they were nearly there. But inside the cabin, everything felt too still, too quiet. Ms. Pratt finally exhaled. I don't know why I did it," she admitted. And for the first time, it wasn't a deflection. It was the truth. Eloise studied her for a long moment before nodding once. "Then figure it out," she said simply. Ms. Pratt swallowed hard, but she nodded, because for the first time, she realized she needed to. She wasn't sure if she could fix this. She wasn't sure if she even deserved to. But she did know one thing. This moment, this mistake, it was going to follow her long after the plane touched the ground. The wheels of the plane touched the runway with a smooth but firm landing, and a quiet murmur rippled through the cabin as passengers stirred in their seats. Seatbelts clicked as people instinctively reached to unfasten them, though the sign was still lit. A voice came over the intercom, calm and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until the captain turns off the seatbelt sign. On behalf of our crew, we'd like to thank you for flying with us today. The usual rustling sounds of post-flight anticipation filled the cabin. Passengers stretching, shifting in their seats, gathering their personal belongings. But Ms. Pratt felt none of the routine comfort she usually did in this moment. Instead, she felt something she had never felt before after a landing. Dread. Her stomach twisted as she looked toward the jet bridge, already knowing that whatever waited for her outside this plane wasn't going to be good. At the front of the first-class cabin, Gerald was already on the in-flight phone, speaking quietly with ground operations. His back was straight, his posture as firm as ever, but there was a slight tension in his movements that told Ms. Pratt he wasn't just preparing for another routine arrival. Eloise, meanwhile, remained as composed as ever, showing no urgency as she reached for her handbag and cane. She didn't seem eager to rush off the plane like most passengers. Instead, she moved with the same steady patience she had shown since the beginning. But when her eyes flickered toward Ms. Pratt, the weight behind them was heavier now. Ms. Pratt forced herself to stand tall. She had done what they asked. She had apologized. She had faced the humiliation. She had served Eloise without protest for the remainder of the flight. So why did it still feel like this wasn't over? The seatbelt sign dinged off. Immediately, passengers began gathering their bags, stepping into the aisles. First-class passengers moved at their usual unbothered pace, taking their time as they reached for their designer carry-ons and neatly folded coats. Dorian Vance stood, adjusting his suit jacket before turning to Ms. Pratt. "Well," he said smoothly, shouldering his bag, "that was certainly eventful." Ms. Pratt said nothing. Dorian studied her for a moment, then gave a slow nod. "You'll be thinking about today for a long time, I imagine." Ms. Pratt felt something in her chest tighten. She didn't want to admit it, but he was right. Without waiting for a response, Dorian turned and stepped off the plane, disappearing into the jet bridge. Ms. Pratt inhaled sharply, bracing herself. She knew she had to keep moving, to keep working. Even if her hands felt heavier, even if her legs felt unsteady. She turned back toward Eloise, watching as the older woman adjusted the strap of her handbag, gripping her cane lightly in one hand. There was no hurry in her movements, no indication that she was eager to step off. Instead, Eloise finally met Ms. Pratt's gaze again, studying her the way one might study an unsolved puzzle. Ms. Pratt felt exposed under that gaze. Then Eloise finally spoke. "Walk with me," she said. Ms. Pratt blinked. "Excuse me?" Eloise gave a small nod toward the open jet bridge. "Walk with me." It wasn't a request. Ms. Pratt hesitated, every muscle in her body screaming at her to find an excuse to stay behind. But Gerald's voice cut through her hesitation. "Go," he said, his tone making it clear she wasn't being given a choice. Ms. Pratt clenched her jaw, exhaled through her nose, and nodded stiffly. Then as Eloise Lancaster stepped off the plane, Ms. Pratt followed. The walk through the jet bridge felt endless. Ms. Pratt could feel the subtle shift in the air as soon as they stepped into the airport terminal. Something was waiting for her. Eloise walked at a slow, steady pace, her cane tapping lightly against the floor with each step. Ms. Pratt stayed a half step behind, keeping her back straight, her breathing controlled. Passengers parted naturally as Eloise moved, but it wasn't just because she was elderly. There was a presence about her, a quiet authority. Ms. Pratt had spent years commanding flights, maintaining control over passengers and staff alike. But here, walking beside Eloise, she felt more powerless than she ever had before. The terminal ahead grew busier, the noise of travelers filling the space around them. Then Ms. Pratt saw them. A group of airline executives stood near a restricted entrance. At the center of them was Robert Ellington, and next to him, airport security. Ms. Pratt's breath hitched. Her steps faltered for just a second, but Eloise kept walking. The closer they got, the more Ms. Pratt could feel her fate closing in. She had known something was coming, but seeing security standing there made it real in a way she wasn't ready for. Her heart pounded against her ribs, but she forced her expression to remain neutral. The executives straightened when Eloise approached, their expressions polite but tense. Robert Ellington stepped forward first, offering Eloise a respectful nod. "Mrs. Lancaster," he greeted smoothly, "I trust your flight was enlightening." Eloise gave a small, knowing smile. Oh, it certainly was. Robert's gaze flickered toward Ms. Pratt. Ms. Pratt, he said, his voice cool and professional. We need to have a conversation. Ms. Pratt's fingers twitched at her sides. Sir, Robert held up a hand. Not here, he interrupted. Come with us. Ms. Pratt felt her stomach drop. Eloise took a step forward, her voice calm but firm. She will take full responsibility for her actions, she said. Won't you, Ms. Pratt? Ms. Pratt's throat felt dry. She had spent the entire flight trying to convince herself she had already paid the price, that her humiliation had been enough. But standing here in front of the airline's top executives, in front of security officers waiting to escort her away, she realized this was only the beginning. Her career, her reputation, her entire future with the airline. It was all about to be decided, and for the first time, she wasn't sure if there was any way to salvage it. Ms. Pratt stood frozen, her mind barely able to process the situation unfolding around her. The hum of the airport terminal felt distant, almost muffled beneath the crushing weight of reality settling on her chest. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist. This was serious. Robert Ellington stood firm, his expression unreadable, but the presence of security waiting at his side told Ms. Pratt everything she needed to know. This wasn't a quiet, behind-closed-doors discussion. This was a reckoning. Eloise Lancaster remained beside her, unbothered, watching with that same quiet, knowing expression. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't angry. She simply expected Ms. Pratt to face what she had done, and now there was no running from it. Ms. Pratt, Robert said again, his voice carrying just enough authority to cut through her spiraling thoughts. Come with us. For the first time in her career, Ms. Pratt hesitated. She had never been the one on this side of a confrontation. She had never been the one told to step forward, to follow, to explain herself. She had always been the one in control, but now she felt like nothing more than a liability being escorted off a plane. She forced herself to move, her stiff legs carrying her forward beside Robert as they walked toward the executive offices. The security officers followed closely behind. It wasn't quite an arrest, but it felt like one. Passengers still lingering in the terminal watched, some with open curiosity, others quickly looking away, pretending not to notice. But they did. Just like on the plane, the whispers had already begun. Ms. Pratt could feel them pressing against her skin. They reached a set of glass doors with the airline's emblem displayed prominently across them. Beyond those doors, Ms. Pratt knew her fate would be decided. Robert swiped his badge and the doors unlocked with a quiet beep. He gestured for her to step inside. Ms. Pratt hesitated, casting one last glance toward Eloise. The older woman was watching, still calm, still collected. But there was something in her gaze, a silent message. Ms. Pratt had no idea what it was, so she turned away and stepped inside. The doors shut behind her. The conference room was cold, not in temperature, but in atmosphere. The long, polished table gleamed under the fluorescent lights, its surface immaculate and untouched. But the tension in the room was suffocating. Seated at the head of the table was James Whitmore, Senior Operations Manager. His sharp gaze locked onto Miss Pratt the second she entered. Beside him sat two other executives, each with a folder in front of them. Her stomach twisted. That was her file. Sit, James instructed, gesturing toward the chair at the far end of the table. Ms. Pratt obeyed, her back stiff as she lowered herself into the seat. The security officers remained near the door, standing silently like sentinels. James leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. You know why you're here? Ms. Pratt forced herself to nod. Yes, sir. James studied her, his expression unreadable. Then tell me, he said, voice even. What happened on that flight? The words felt like a trap. Ms. Pratt's first instinct was to defend herself, to explain that she had been doing her job, that she had been following procedure, that it had all been a misunderstanding. But she knew better now. So instead, she inhaled sharply and answered honestly. I made an assumption about a passenger, she admitted, and because of that assumption, I treated her unfairly. James didn't react, didn't nod in approval, didn't show disappointment. He simply waited. Ms. Pratt swallowed hard. I humiliated her publicly, she continued. I dismissed her, And when she didn't step aside, I put my hands on her. James finally leaned back in his chair. Do you realize what you just admitted to? Ms. Pratt's fingers curled slightly against her lap. Yes. The other executives exchanged glances. They hadn't expected her to admit it so directly. James exhaled through his nose. Ms. Pratt, you've been with this airline for how long? 10 years, she answered. 10 years, he repeated, shaking his head. Then you should already know that what you did is grounds for immediate termination. Ms. Pratt's stomach clenched. She had expected those words, but hearing them out loud made it real. James flipped open the folder in front of him, skimming through the printed documents inside. We have passenger statements, a report from the captain, a complaint filed directly by Mrs. Lancaster herself. Ms. Pratt felt her breath hitch. She hadn't realized Eloise had filed a complaint. The weight of it settled heavily on her chest. James closed the folder and placed his hands on the table. The only reason you're in this room instead of already being escorted out of the building is because Mrs. Lancaster specifically requested that we allow you a chance to speak before a decision is made. Ms. Pratt's eyes snapped up in surprise. Wait, she said before she could stop herself. She requested that? James's gaze remained firm. She did. Ms. Pratt couldn't process it. After everything she had done, after how she had treated Eloise, why would the older woman fight for her to have a chance to explain herself? She turned slightly, glancing toward the glass doors. Through them, she could see Eloise seated in the lounge outside, waiting, still watching. Ms. Pratt didn't understand. But for the first time since stepping into the room, she felt something new. Not fear, not shame, but the opportunity to make this right. She turned back to the table, exhaling slowly. I know I deserve to be fired, she said, her voice quieter now. But I don't want my last moment in this airline to be about what I did wrong. She lifted her chin, her throat tight, but her voice steadier now. I want to prove that I can learn from it. James Whitmore raised an eyebrow. And how exactly do you plan to do that? Ms. Pratt had no idea, but for the first time in a long time, she was ready to find out. A heavy silence filled the conference room as Ms. Pratt's words settled in the air. She could feel every pair of eyes on her. James Whitmore's cold and assessing, the other executives wary and unconvinced. Even the security officer standing near the door seemed to be waiting to see if she had anything worth saying. She swallowed, pushing down the lump in her throat. She had spent the entire flight defending herself in her own mind, convincing herself that she had already done enough to make up for what had happened. But now sitting here, she knew the truth. Apologizing wasn't enough. Saying she had learned something didn't mean she actually had. James leaned forward, his fingers tapping lightly against the table. Ms. Pratt, do you even understand why this situation is as serious as it is? Ms. Pratt inhaled sharply. She had expected this. She had prepared for it. But now actually being asked to say the words out loud, she felt the weight of them pressing down on her. She thought back to the moment she had stopped Eloise at the gate, the way she had dismissed her so easily, the way she hadn't even bothered to check the system, because in her mind, she had already decided that Eloise Lancaster did not belong in first class. That was the truth, and that truth was ugly. Ms. Pratt straightened her posture, forcing herself to own it. I thought I was just following protocol, she admitted, but I wasn't. James raised an eyebrow. Then what were you doing? Ms. Pratt exhaled slowly. I was making a decision based on my own assumptions. The room remained silent, but she could feel the shift. She hesitated, but only for a moment, because for the first time, she wasn't afraid to say it out loud. I looked at Mrs. Lancaster, and I assumed she wasn't supposed to be in first class, she said. I didn't check her ticket properly. I didn't listen when she tried to correct me. And when she didn't move, I let my frustration take over, and I put my hands on her. Her stomach twisted as she admitted it all. James's gaze didn't waver. So you're admitting that your actions weren't just a mistake? They were based on bias? Ms. Pratt felt something tighten in her chest. That word, bias, it made her skin crawl. But she couldn't deny it. She nodded slowly. Yes. The confession felt like pulling a blade from her own chest. But the moment the words left her lips, she realized something. This was the first time she had truly, fully admitted it. Not just to save her job, not just because it was expected, but because she finally understood. James leaned back, folding his arms. The other executives exchanged unreadable glances, but no one spoke. For the first time, Ms. Pratt realized they hadn't expected her to say that. They had expected excuses, deflection, some desperate attempt to justify her behavior. Instead, she had given them the truth. James exhaled slowly. "And now?" he asked. Ms. Pratt blinked. "Sir? What do you plan to do now?" he asked, his gaze steady. "You say you want to prove you've learned something, but words mean nothing unless there's action behind them." Ms. Pratt hesitated. What could she do? The damage was already done. The passengers had seen what happened. The airline's reputation had been put at risk. She had already lost their trust. And yet, she didn't want this to be the end of her story. She inhaled deeply, gathering her thoughts. "I don't expect to walk out of here with my job," she admitted, "and I don't expect forgiveness either. But if I'm given the chance, I want to help fix the kind of environment that made me feel justified in what I did." James's expression remained neutral, but he didn't interrupt. Ms. Pratt swallowed, forcing herself to continue. "This airline teaches us about policies, about safety, about service," she said. "But I don't think I ever really understood what it meant to serve all passengers equally. I thought I did, but I didn't. And if I'm allowed to stay, I want to be part of changing that." The room was silent. Ms. Pratt didn't know if she had said the right thing, but it was the only thing that felt real. James studied her for a long moment before finally speaking. "Wait outside," he instructed. Ms. Pratt nodded, rising stiffly from her seat. The security officers didn't move to escort her out this time. She took that as a small victory. As she stepped back into the waiting area, her breath felt shaky in her chest. And then she saw Eloise Lancaster, still seated, still waiting. Eloise turned her head, her eyes meeting Ms. Pratt's. And for the first time since this entire ordeal began, Ms. Pratt didn't feel like looking away. Ms. Pratt stood there facing Eloise Lancaster, feeling the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on her. For the first time, she didn't try to avoid the older woman's gaze. She didn't shift uncomfortably. She didn't pretend that she wasn't standing on the edge of losing everything. She simply waited. Eloise, calm as ever, set her handbag neatly on her lap. "They're discussing your future in there," she said, nodding toward the glass doors of the conference room. Her voice was even, as if this were nothing more than a casual conversation between two strangers. But they weren't strangers anymore. Not after today. Miss Pratt swallowed. "I know." Eloise tilted her head slightly. "And what do you think they'll decide?" Miss Pratt hesitated. If she had been asked that question an hour ago, she would have still been fighting for her job. Still scrambling for excuses, still convincing herself that she could talk her way out of this. But now she wasn't sure she deserved to keep it. She exhaled, her throat tight. "I don't know," she admitted. "I suppose that depends on whether they believe I can change." Eloise studied her, tapping her fingers lightly against the handle of her cane. "Can you?" Ms. Pratt's fingers twitched at her sides. "I'd like to try," she said finally. Eloise gave a soft hum of acknowledgement. Not approval, not dismissal, just acknowledgement. For some reason, that felt heavier than anything else. Ms. Pratt took a slow breath, then finally asked the question she had been afraid to ask. "Why did you request for them to give me a chance to explain myself?" Eloise's lips curled slightly. Not quite a smile, but something close. "Because I wanted to see if you would use that chance to defend yourself," she said, "or if you would use it to face the truth." Ms. Pratt felt something sink in her stomach. That's what this had been about. Eloise had given her a chance to speak, but not because she wanted to hear excuses. Not because she wanted Ms. Pratt to save her job. She wanted to see if Ms. Pratt was even capable of understanding what she had done. And Ms. Pratt finally understood something too. Eloise hadn't been powerless in that moment at the gate. She had allowed Ms. Pratt to show her true nature. And when that nature had revealed something ugly, Eloise had let her sit in that mistake until she had no choice but to confront it. Ms. Pratt exhaled slowly. "You could have demanded that I be fired immediately." Eloise's gaze didn't waver. "Yes," she said simply. Ms. Pratt hesitated, then asked the second question pressing at the back of her mind. "Why didn't you?" Eloise was quiet for a long moment before answering. Because I don't believe in letting people walk away from their mistakes without learning from them. The word sent a strange, unfamiliar feeling through Ms. Pratt's chest. This was no kindness. This was no favor. Eloise Lancaster had never needed an apology from her. She had never needed justice from the airline. What she had wanted was for Ms. Pratt to face herself, and that was exactly what had happened. The doors to the conference room opened. Ms. Pratt turned instantly, her breath catching slightly as James Whitmore stepped out, his expression still unreadable. The other executives followed, their postures rigid, their gazes flickering toward Eloise briefly before settling back on Ms. Pratt. Robert Ellington remained at the door, glancing between them before finally speaking. "We've made our decision." Ms. Pratt's hands curled slightly at her sides. She braced herself. James studied her carefully. "Effective immediately, you are being placed on probation." Ms. Pratt's breath hitched. Probation? She had expected one of two outcomes. Either she would keep her job completely, or she would lose it. But probation meant something else entirely. It meant she was being given a chance. James continued, his voice firm. "You will undergo additional training, including leadership and anti-bias programs. Your role will be evaluated for the next 6 months. If at any point you fail to meet expectations, you will be terminated without further discussion." Ms. Pratt didn't know what to say. She had thought she was prepared for any answer, but she hadn't expected this. She wasn't being let off easily. She wasn't walking away without consequence. She was being given the opportunity to prove whether she could truly change. The reality of it settled into her chest like a weight. James narrowed his eyes slightly. "Do you understand?" Ms. Pratt straightened her back. "Yes, sir." "Good." James glanced toward Eloise. "Mrs. Lancaster has signed off on this decision. If she had wanted you fired, you would have been." Ms. Pratt slowly turned back to Eloise. The older woman met her gaze without hesitation. She hadn't fought for Ms. Pratt to keep her job. She had fought for her to earn it, and now it was in Ms. Pratt's hands. Ms. Pratt swallowed hard. "Thank you," she said quietly. Eloise gave her a slow nod. "Make it mean something," she said. And then, with a quiet tap of her cane against the floor, she turned and walked away. Ms. Pratt stood there, watching as Eloise Lancaster walked away with the same steady grace she had carried throughout the entire ordeal. The rhythmic tap, tap, tap of her cane echoed softly against the polished airport floor, fading with each step until she disappeared into the crowd. For the first time since this all began, Ms. Pratt didn't feel resentment. She didn't feel anger. She didn't even feel relief. She felt small. Not in the way she had when she had been humiliated in front of the passengers. Not in the way she had felt when Gerald had called her out, but in the way a person feels when they realize just how much they still have to learn. She had spent years believing she knew everything there was to know about her job, believing she could read passengers before they even spoke, that she could tell exactly who belonged and who didn't, that she had the authority to determine the order of things. But she had been wrong, and Eloise Lancaster had let her see it. James Whitmore's voice pulled her back to reality. "Report to training headquarters first thing Monday morning," he said. "You'll receive further instructions then." Ms. Pratt nodded stiffly. "Yes, sir." James gave one last glance toward her, then exchanged looks with the other executives before they turned and walked away, leaving Ms. Pratt standing there alone. She exhaled, slowly unclenching her fists. She had a second chance. But it wasn't a clean slate. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a test, one she wasn't sure she could pass. The airport buzzed with movement, passengers coming and going, oblivious to the lesson that had just unfolded in its halls. Ms. Pratt turned toward the terminal windows, staring out at the rows of planes lined up along the tarmac. Somewhere, another flight attendant was making the same snap judgments she had made. Somewhere, another passenger was being dismissed without question. And she wondered, for the first time in her life, how many times had she done the same? How many people had walked away from her flights feeling like they had been made to prove they belonged? How many passengers had looked her in the eyes and seen exactly who she was before she ever realized it herself? The thought made her uncomfortable, but maybe that was the point. She wasn't supposed to be comfortable. She had spent her whole career enforcing rules, maintaining control, making sure the cabin ran exactly how she wanted it to. Now, for the first time, she had to listen. She had to learn. She had to change. And this time, she wouldn't have a choice. With one final glance at the emptying terminal, Ms. Pratt took a deep breath. Then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the exit. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Thanks for watching.